I woke up to the dull, throbbing ache of a hangover, the kind that settled deep in my skull and made every shift of my body feel like moving through syrup, my limbs heavy, my mouth dry, my memories hazy at the edges like a dream I had almost forgotten. The sheets were twisted around me, damp with sweat, and as I turned onto my side I felt it. A sharp stinging pull along my ribs, like I had been gripped too tightly, like someone's fingers had dug into my skin with the kind of pressure that lingers long after they've let go. I squinted against the thin sliver of morning light creeping through my curtains and dragged myself upright, my head pounding in protest, my stomach twisting uncomfortably, and when I glanced down at myself blinking the sleep from my eyes, that was when I saw them. Dark, unmistakable bruises scattered like ink blots across my arms, my thighs, my hips, my wrists, the unmistakable shape of fingerprints pressed deep into my skin. For a long, heavy moment I just sat there running my fingers over the marks, pressing into them lightly, wincing at the tenderness, at the way they looked almost fresh, almost like they had appeared just seconds ago, just under my own fingertips. I had gone out last night. I remembered that much, the clinking of glasses, the warm flush of alcohol spreading through my limbs, the way the bar had been too crowded, too loud, filled with that electric hum of Valentine's Day energy. All red dresses and cheap perfume and the desperate search for connection. I had met someone, hadn't I? A man, tall, charming in that effortless way, with hands that traced the curve of my spine as we danced, as we laughed, as I let him lead me outside into the cool night air, his breath warm against my ear, his voice low and teasing, asking me if I wanted one more drink, one more kiss, one more moment that neither of us would have to regret. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to pull the memory into focus, but it was like grasping at mist, slippery, fleeting, dissolving the harder I reached for it. With a groggy exhale I reached for my phone, half expecting to see his name in my recent calls or messages, something, anything, that would ground last night in reality, but there was nothing. No messages, no calls, no new contacts added, not even a charge on my bank statement for the drinks I knew I had paid for. My pulse quickened, a slow, creeping unease working its way up my spine as I tapped through my photos, hoping for some blurred, drunken snapshot of the night, some proof that he existed, that I hadn't just imagined his hands on me, his mouth against my skin, his fingers pressing deep enough to leave these bruises behind. But there was nothing, no pictures, no hints, no remnants of his presence at all, just the dark, shadowy imprints on my body and the faintest echo of his voice whispering through my mind, something soft, something almost playful, something that sent a sharp, ice-cold shiver through my bones. I'm not done with you yet. By the time I stepped out of the shower, my skin pink from the scalding water, my muscles loosened but my nerves still coiled tight, I had convinced myself that I was overreacting, that the bruises were just the remnants of a drunken night, that I had let some stranger's hands linger too long on my body, that I had willingly given myself over to the moment, even if the details had started to slip through the cracks of my memory. But as I wiped the condensation from the mirror and leaned closer, my stomach twisting into knots, I saw something that made my breath hitch. Beneath the surface bruises, barely visible at first, faint outlines of something more began to emerge, not just fingerprints anymore but thin, winding lines curling along my ribs, symbols I didn't recognize, shapes too precise to be accidental, spreading slowly across my skin like ink sinking into paper. My pulse stuttered, my hand shaking as I pressed my fingertips against them, as if I could wipe them away, as if I could make them disappear through sheer will. But the moment I touched them, a sharp, cold sensation shot through my body, a crawling, prickling awareness that something was watching me. I stumbled back from the mirror, my towel slipping from my shoulders, my damp hair clinging to my skin, and I forced myself to laugh, to shake my head, to remind myself that I was being ridiculous, that I was still half asleep, still trapped in the fog of a hangover, still letting my overactive imagination turn a few bruises into something sinister. But as I reached for my phone again, determined to retrace my steps, to check my call logs, my messages, my location history, to find even the smallest piece of evidence that last night had actually happened the way I thought it had, I felt it. The unmistakable sensation of fingers grazing the back of my neck, feather-light but deliberate, lingering just long enough to make my whole body go rigid, to send a pulse of ice-cold terror rocketing through me. My breath hitched in my throat, my fingers tightening around my phone, my heart pounding so violently I could hear it echoing in my ears, and I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance, my eyes scanning the bathroom, the doorway, the empty, fog-filled space around me. There was no one there. Swallowing hard, my hands still trembling, I backed away, every hair on my body standing on end, my skin tingling with something I couldn't explain, something I didn't want to explain, and when I turned back toward the mirror my stomach dropped so fast I thought I might be sick. The fogged-up glass, still streaked from where I had wiped it clean just moments before, had changed, had shifted, not from my hand, not from steam or condensation, but from something else, something unseen, something that had been standing behind me when I wasn't looking. There, in smeared, uneven letters, barely visible against the fading fog, were 2 words scrawled across the surface of the mirror. Words that sent a jagged bolt of raw, breath-stealing fear straight through my chest. Miss me? I don't remember getting dressed. I don't remember grabbing my keys or shoving my feet into my sneakers or even locking the door behind me as I all but ran down the stairs of my apartment building, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath coming in quick, uneven gasps as I burst out onto the street, desperate for air, for noise, for people, for something that wasn't the suffocating, invisible presence that had curled around me in that bathroom like a pair of unseen arms. The cold February wind bit into my damp skin as I stumbled toward the cafe on the corner, the one I always stopped at on my way to work, the one that had become a familiar backdrop to my morning routine, with its crowded tables and the hum of conversation and the comforting hiss of the espresso machine, all the normal, mundane things that suddenly felt so impossibly distant from the place I had just escaped. I needed to sit down to steady my shaking hands, to convince myself that this was just stress, just exhaustion, just the lingering effects of too much alcohol and too little sleep. And yet, as I pulled out my phone and stared at my call history, at my empty messages, at the glaring absence of anything that proved I had even spoken to Jonah last night, my stomach twisted into a tight, sickening knot. I tapped open my banking app, hoping to at least find some record of the bar, some transaction, some proof that I had even been there, but my account showed nothing. No pending charges, no receipts, no late-night Uber ride back to my apartment, just the same unchanging balance as if last night had never happened at all. My fingers trembled as I switched to my photo gallery, my breath held tight in my throat, searching for anything, some drunken selfie, some blurry snapshot of the neon-lit bar, something that would make me feel like I hadn't just imagined it, like I hadn't just dreamed the entire thing, but every picture was exactly as I had left it, untouched, unchanged, no evidence that I had met him, no proof that I had spent the night with him, no sign of the man whose hands had left their imprint on my skin. I closed my eyes for a moment, pressing my fingers against my temples, trying to breathe through the rising panic, the suffocating weight of wrongness that curled around my chest like a vice. Because this wasn't possible. This wasn't real. This wasn't something that happened in real life. Not to me, not to anyone. I had to retrace my steps, had to talk to someone who had seen me, who could tell me I wasn't losing my mind, who could confirm that I had walked into that bar last night with a real flesh and blood man and not just some flickering hallucination pulled from the depths of my own subconscious. I threw a crumpled $5 bill onto the table and practically sprinted back down the street, my pulse thrumming wildly as I made my way to the bar, my breath fogging in the cold air, my fingers still curled around my phone like a lifeline. When I stepped inside, the dim, amber glow of the hanging lights and the low murmur of conversation should have felt familiar, should have settled something deep inside me, but instead, a fresh wave of unease crashed over me as I made my way toward the counter, my voice tight, too high, too fast, as I blurted out the question before I could stop myself. Hey, I was here last night. I was with someone, a guy, tall, dark hair, name was Jonah. Do you remember seeing us? The bartender, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes, looked at me for a long, unreadable moment, then shook his head, his expression blank, his answer simple but crushing in its finality. You came in alone. I stood there, gripping the edge of the bar so tightly that my knuckles ached, my pulse pounding in my ears, the bartender's words echoing over and over in my skull like a cruel joke I wasn't in on, like some twisted reality that only I was being forced to question. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, that cautious, skeptical look people give when they think you're either too drunk or too unstable to be taken seriously, and I wanted to shake him, to make him see, to drag him into the suffocating, impossible wrongness of this moment, but all I could do was swallow against the rising nausea and force myself to breathe. My mind was spinning, my stomach twisting, my skin still burning with the ghost of fingers that shouldn't have existed, and I wanted to argue, to insist that he was mistaken, that I hadn't been alone, that I had felt Jonah's presence, had heard his voice, had traced the sharp curve of his jaw with my own fingers, but there was something in the bartender's unwavering certainty that made the words shrivel in my throat. In his world, in everyone's world but mine, Jonah had never been there at all. I turned away before I could embarrass myself further, my breath uneven, my thoughts unraveling, my entire body vibrating with the sickening sensation of being displaced, like I had stepped out of sync with time, like I had been shifted just slightly out of phase with my own life. The air in the bar felt heavier now, pressing against my skin, thick and cloying like humidity before a storm, and as I fumbled my way outside into the sharp, cutting cold of the February evening, I barely noticed the way my hand shook as I reached for my phone, my fingers clumsy, frantic, desperate to find something, anything, that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. I opened my call log again, scanning for his number, for a missed call, for some kind of text that I had forgotten, but the screen stared back at me, cold and empty, as if my phone itself had conspired against me, erasing him, deleting any trace of his existence, wiping him from my world like he had never been there at all. My throat tightened, my breathing turned shallow, and for the first time since waking up, I felt something close to fear, not just unease, not just confusion, but real gut-clenching fear that slithered beneath my ribs and wrapped itself around my heart with icy fingers. And then my phone buzzed. My fingers hovered over the screen, my breath caught in my chest, a sharp spike of adrenaline slicing through my veins as I forced myself to look. It was a message, an unknown number, no contact name, nothing to indicate who had sent it. My thumb trembled as I tapped it open, and as the words blinked onto the screen, my entire body went still, my lungs forgetting how to function, my vision narrowing to the small, glowing letters that sent a bolt of sheer, paralyzing terror straight through my spine. Miss me. I don't remember walking back to my apartment, don't remember stepping through the front door or locking it behind me, don't remember collapsing onto my couch with my phone still clutched in my shaking hands, but at some point I must have, because now I was sitting there in the dim glow of the streetlights filtering through my blinds, staring at that message on my screen like it was a bomb waiting to go off, my breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps, my skin crawling with the unbearable sensation of being watched. My rational mind, the part of me that still clung to logic, was screaming that this was a prank, that someone must have seen me at the bar last night, that maybe I had given my number to a stranger and forgotten, that maybe, just maybe, there was a reasonable explanation for all of this, but deep down beneath the desperate grasping for normalcy, something colder, something sharper, something ancient inside me knew that wasn't true. This was him, the man who shouldn't exist, the man I couldn't prove was real, reaching out from the empty spaces in my memory, reminding me that I had let him in. My hands were slick with sweat as I forced myself to type out a response, my fingers barely steady enough to form the words. A single simple question that felt too small for the enormity of what was happening. Who is this? I hit send and waited, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The silence of my apartment suddenly too loud, too heavy, pressing in on me from all sides. Seconds passed, then a full minute, then another, and just when I started to let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my phone vibrated again. The screen flashing once in the dim light, and I felt a fresh jolt of nausea roll through me as I looked down and saw the reply. You know who I am. A cold shudder ripped through my spine, my body recoiling like I had been struck, and in that moment, as I sat there in my silent apartment with the shadows stretching long against the walls, I became acutely aware of the fact that I was not alone, that there was something here with me, something I couldn't see, something just beyond the veil of my understanding, hovering at the edges of my perception like a breath against my skin. Then, slowly, deliberately, my phone screen dimmed, the text vanishing into darkness, the glow of the display flickering out before I could react, before I could move, before I could even think. And as the room was swallowed in silence once more, something moved in the reflection of my TV screen. Something that shouldn't have been there, something tall and dark and standing right behind me. My body locked up, every muscle frozen in place, my breath stilled in my throat, my entire being reduced to a single thundering pulse of fear as I stared, wide-eyed, at the impossible shape looming in the screen's glassy surface, its head tilting slightly, its shadowy form stretching toward me. And then, just as my brain caught up with the sheer, paralyzing wrongness of what I was seeing, just as my nerves finally snapped and I forced myself to spin around, to look, to face whatever was standing there, there was nothing. Just my empty apartment. Just the faint hum of the streetlights outside. Just the ghost of something that had been there a second ago, something that had left behind the scent of cold air and the phantom touch of fingers trailing down the back of my neck. A whisper curling into my ear like a promise I wasn't meant to hear. I told you. You touched me first. I don't know how long I sat there, my body rigid, my breath shallow. my skin still tingling from the sensation of those unseen fingers trailing down the back of my neck. But eventually, the silence became unbearable, pressing down on me with a weight so suffocating I thought I might scream just to break it. My phone lay face down on the coffee table, dark and useless. The last message still burned into my mind. You touched me first. The words churned in my stomach like something alive, something writhing, something trying to claw its way out. And the worst part, the thing that made my insides twist with an awful sick understanding, was that I didn't know if he was lying. There were gaps in my memory. Entire pieces of last night that felt smeared at the edges like a photograph touched before the ink had dried. Moments I couldn't grasp no matter how hard I reached for them. Had I said his name first? Had I pulled him closer? Had I invited him in? The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through me, and before I could talk myself out of it, before I could convince myself I was being insane, I grabbed my coat and practically ran out the door, the cold night air slamming into me like a slap, shocking me back into something close to clarity. I didn't know where I was going, not exactly, but my body moved with the frantic desperation of someone who needed answers, who needed something solid to hold on to, something real to ground myself in before I lost my grip completely. My feet carried me 3 blocks east, past the dim glow of street lamps, past the shuttered storefronts and empty sidewalks, until I was standing in front of a tiny, unassuming shop wedged between 2 apartment buildings, the kind of place you only noticed when you were looking for it. The neon sign in the window flickered weakly, casting fractured red light onto the sidewalk, and for a moment I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the door handle as a deep, gut-level dread coiled in my stomach like a warning, whispering that if I stepped inside, I would learn something I could never unlearn. But then I pushed the door open, the bell above it jingling softly, and the scent of burning incense wrapped around me like smoke, thick and cloying and ancient. The woman behind the counter looked up the moment I stepped inside, her dark eyes locking onto mine, her expression unreadable, like she had been expecting me, like she already knew. I didn't even have to speak before she sighed, shaking her head slightly, as if she had seen this before, as if she had seen me before, and when she finally opened her mouth, her voice was quiet but heavy, each word pressing into my skin like a bruise. You shouldn't have touched him. My pulse skipped, a sharp, panicked stutter. My mouth suddenly too dry, my entire body locking up with the sheer, terrible finality in her voice. I swallowed hard, my hands clenching at my sides, and somehow, despite the tightness in my throat, despite the cold sweat breaking out along my spine, I forced the words out, barely more than a whisper. What is he? The woman exhaled slowly, like she was measuring her next words, like she was bracing herself for the weight of them, and when she finally answered, it was with the kind of quiet, bone-deep certainty that made my breath stall in my lungs. He's not a man. I don't remember leaving the shop, don't remember stepping back out into the freezing night air, don't remember the walk home, but somehow I ended up back in my apartment, sitting on the floor with my back pressed against the locked door, my entire body shaking with the kind of bone-deep dread that made my skin feel too tight, my heartbeat too loud, my breath too sharp in the silence. The woman's words wouldn't stop circling in my head, sinking into me like ice, like they had settled somewhere beneath my ribs and taken root. He's not a man. There had been something in her voice, something old, something certain, something that told me she had seen this before, that I was not the first, that there had been others, and if that was true, if there had been others before me, then where were they now? I wanted to believe that I could fix this, that I could shake him off like a bad dream, that this was something I could outrun, outthink, outfight, but deep down I already knew the truth. He was attached to me now. He was inside of me, beneath my skin, in the bruises that still refused to fade, in the whispers that curled around my ears at night, in the phantom hands that pressed against my spine when I wasn't looking. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to steady my breathing, trying to force down the rising panic, but before I could even think about what to do next, my phone buzzed from where it lay on the floor beside me, the sharp vibration shattering the silence like a gunshot. My fingers fumbled as I grabbed it, my stomach twisting into knots, my pulse hammering against my ribs, because I already knew what I was going to see before I even looked. The screen glowed in the dim light, another message from the unknown number, another piece of the nightmare that was unraveling around me, another reminder that I was not alone. But this time it wasn't just words. It wasn't a taunt or a question, or some unseen whisper curling its way into my head. This time it was a photo. My breath caught, my fingers tightening around the phone so hard my knuckles ached, Because I recognized the room instantly. The dim lighting, the familiar layout, the rumpled sheets. It was my bedroom. And sprawled across my bed, her body unnaturally still, her face turned just slightly toward the camera, was my best friend Emily. I don't remember running to my bedroom. I don't remember the sharp sting of my bare feet slamming against the floor as I nearly tripped in my rush to get there. I don't remember how I forced myself to breathe through the panic, how I reached for her with shaking hands, how I whispered her name over and over as if I could somehow will her to wake up. Her skin was ice cold beneath my fingertips, her lips parted just slightly, her expression eerily peaceful, as if she had simply drifted off mid-sentence. And then as my shaking fingers reached for my phone, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps, I saw it, the bruises. Deep, shadowy imprints blooming across her throat, along her wrists, curling over her collarbones like fingerprints pressed into flesh, like something had held her down. I just sat there, the silence closing in around me, my mind blank with the sheer, paralyzing weight of the realization settling over me like a grave. I wasn't the first. And I wouldn't be the last. I don't remember how long I sat there on the edge of my bed, my fingers still curled uselessly around my phone, my breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps, my entire body locked in place as if moving, as if even blinking would make it real, would make me have to accept that Emily was gone, that she had died in my bed in my home, because I had let something in, because I had touched something I never should have, because he had chosen me. The room felt impossibly still, heavy with a silence so thick I could hear my own heartbeat slamming against my ribs, my own ragged breathing cutting through the air like a blade, and somewhere beneath it, beneath the ringing in my ears and the sheer, suffocating weight of what was happening, I swore I could hear it, the faintest rustle of fabric, the almost imperceptible shift of weight on the mattress behind me, the sensation of presence, of something waiting, something watching, something impossibly patient. My hands trembled as I forced myself to look, as I turned my head in slow mechanical increments, my pulse roaring so loud I could barely hear the creak of the bed springs beneath me, but the moment my gaze flickered toward the foot of the bed, every muscle in my body locked up in pure animal terror. The shape was there exactly where I knew it would be, a dark figure standing at the very edge of my vision, its outline barely distinct from the deep shadows stretching across the walls, its head tilted slightly, its arms hanging too still at its sides, its presence so wrong that my brain struggled to process it, to accept it, to even fully see it. My breath hitched, my fingers tightening against my phone, my body coiling with the overwhelming, desperate urge to run, to scream, to do something, but before I could even move, before I could even process what was happening, the air in the room shifted, thickened, the temperature plummeting so rapidly that I could see my own breath curling in thin, trembling wisps in front of me, and then he moved. It was slow at first, a subtle shifting of weight, the faintest tilt forward, but then all at once the darkness poured toward me, like shadow and breath and presence all condensed into something that wasn't human, something that had been waiting, something that whispered in a voice so close, so intimate, so deep inside my own mind that I felt it like fingers pressing against my throat. You can't run from me. I don't know how I broke free of the paralysis gripping my body, don't know how I managed to move, to shove myself backward, to scream, but somehow I did, somehow I forced my limbs to work, forced my voice to rip through the silence, forced my body to stumble away from the bed, from the impossible thing that was no longer just lingering in the corners of my vision but reaching for me, hands outstretched, fingers curling in the air like it could already feel me in its grasp. My back hit the door, my hands scrambling for the handle, my breath coming in sharp, frantic gasps, and just as I wrenched it open, just as I stumbled into the hallway, the last thing I saw before I tore through my apartment and into the freezing night was Emily's body shifting, her lips parting just slightly, her breath curling in the cold air, her eyes still closed, but her mouth forming a whisper that wasn't her voice, wasn't human, wasn't anything I had ever heard before. Don't fight it. I don't remember running, don't remember how my feet carried me down the stairs of my building. Don't remember bursting out into the night air, my breath ragged, my hands ice cold, my vision swimming with the kind of blind, unfiltered terror that turned everything into a blur of color and motion and sound. The city around me was still alive, the streets busy with people moving through their own small worlds, laughing, talking, drinking, completely unaware that just a few blocks away, something unnatural had slithered its way into existence, that something wrong was stretching its fingers toward me, that my world had tilted on an axis I couldn't pull back from. I stumbled forward, almost crashing into a group of people leaving a bar, my pulse hammering so violently it felt like my ribs would crack beneath the pressure, and I wanted to scream, wanted to grab someone, anyone, and tell them what was happening, tell them that I wasn't alone, that there was something behind me, something pressing its weight against my skin, something that had already killed Emily, something that was still following me. But when I forced myself to glance over my shoulder, to look back toward the apartment I had just fled, I saw nothing. No whisper of movement in the cold night air. And somehow that was worse. I sucked in a breath, dragging shaking hands through my hair, forcing myself to think, to move, to find answers, because I couldn't keep running in blind panic circles, couldn't let myself become some terrified animal sprinting toward an end I couldn't see. My fingers curled around my phone in my pocket, but I didn't call the police. What could I possibly tell them? That my best friend was dead but also wasn't? That I had been hunted, claimed by something I had touched without knowing what it was? Instead, I turned my feet in the direction I already knew they were going, my body moving before my mind could catch up, leading me back toward the only place that had given me any kind of answers, the only person who might understand. The neon sign above the psychic's shop flickered as I approached, casting broken red light onto the pavement, the door unlocked, the inside warm and thick with the scent of burning incense, and when I stepped inside, when I closed the door behind me, I found her waiting. Standing there like she knew I was coming, like she knew what had happened, like she had already seen the ending I was hurtling toward. I didn't speak right away, couldn't find the words, couldn't force them past the thick knot in my throat, but she didn't need me to. She just watched me for a long, heavy moment, her dark eyes steady, unreadable, her hands resting on the wooden counter as if bracing herself for what she was about to say. Then, slowly, carefully, she exhaled, tilting her head just slightly, and when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, quieter but heavier, like it carried the weight of something inevitable. "You can still stop this," she murmured, her gaze locked onto mine, her expression unreadable. "But you won't walk away untouched. He's already inside you now." I swallowed hard, the room spinning, my breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts, my entire body coiling with the impossible, horrible understanding of what she was telling me. And the question that curled like smoke in the back of my mind, the question I already knew I was too afraid to ask, was simple. What if I don't want him to let go? I don't remember making the choice, don't remember forming the words, don't remember the exact moment I surrendered to what had already been written into my skin, but somehow I knew that I had always been moving toward this moment, that every step I had taken since that night had been guiding me toward something inevitable, something irreversible. The psychic's words barely registered, her voice a distant hum beneath the roaring in my ears, beneath the thundering beat of my own pulse as she traced symbols onto the wooden counter with slow, deliberate movements, her fingers pressing into the surface like she was marking something permanent, something binding, something ancient. My body felt impossibly heavy, weighted by exhaustion, by grief, by the cold, creeping realization that I was no longer just myself, that I had not been alone since the moment I had touched him, that he had woven himself into me, had become something inside of me, something that could not be pulled free without tearing me apart in the process. I wanted to believe that I could fight it, that I could erase him, sever him, banish him, but the truth settled over me like a second skin, clinging to me as surely as his hands had. I was not leaving this untouched. The ritual burned through me like fire, like ice, like something ancient and angry, something that was being forced away, something that did not want to let go. The psychic's voice rose and fell in a language I did not understand, her hands moving through the air in sharp, cutting motions, and as the temperature in the room plummeted, as my vision blurred at the edges, as my knees threatened to buckle beneath me, I felt him fight. I felt his hands clawing at my ribs, felt his fingers curling into my throat, felt his voice splitting through my skull, whispering in that same low, familiar murmur that had once been a promise, had once been a temptation, had once been a touch that made my skin burn. "You don't want me to leave." My breath caught, my chest tightening, my vision swimming with something dark, something infinite, and for one single paralyzing moment, I realized that he was right, that he had never forced his way in, that I had called him, had wanted him, had touched him first. My own voice trembled in the air, cracked and raw and desperate as I choked out a single final plea, barely more than a whisper. "Please." Then silence. The room snapped back into stillness, the air suddenly warm again, the weight in my chest lifting, the bruises fading from my skin in slow, curling wisps of shadow dissolving like smoke beneath my fingertips. I let out a breath, my legs nearly giving out beneath me, my body weak and trembling, my mind blank with exhaustion, with relief, with something else I couldn't quite name, something that felt too much like loss. The psychic studied me for a long, quiet moment, her dark eyes searching, knowing, already seeing the thing I was only just beginning to understand, and when she finally spoke, her voice was softer, but no less final. "He's gone," she murmured, but I could hear the unspoken words beneath it, could feel the truth sinking into my bones even before I turned to leave, before I stepped back out into the cold night, before I walked away from the place that had stripped him from me. He was gone, but he was not forgotten. His touch lingered. It would always linger. And as I stepped into the quiet dark of the city, my breath curling in the cold air, I felt it. Just for a second, just barely there. Just the faintest ghost of something trailing down my spine, something pressing against my skin, something whispering in a voice that I would never stop hearing. "I told you. I'm not done with you yet."